Good morning, Mr. Billings.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm very good.
That's good. Well, welcome inside of Cool Meditations. This is David Billings, the author of Deep Denial. Quite a title. And I found out about Mr. Billings because he's going to be in Poughkeepsie on March 8th promoting his book at the Family Partnership Center. So, Mr. Billings, tell us a bit about your background.
Well, I'm a native Mississippian. I've lived and worked in the South most of my life. I've worked some in New York City. But my background is that of a person who has attempted to combat racism, both personally and in institutional life here in the United States. I'm married to Marjorie Freeman, and we have 3 children and 6 grandchildren.
Oh, well, bless your heart.
Well, thank you.
All right. And speaking of blessings, you are, I was told, a minister?
Yes, United Methodist Church, yes.
All right.
I'm retired, yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, I just thought it was important to note that, there are many people who advocate for black folks, but interestingly, you're not black, right?
No, I'm not. I'm white, yeah.
Okay. So, that being said, tell us about your time in Mississippi and what you observed.
Well, when I was growing up, Mississippi was, for all intents and purposes, an apartheid state. It had very strict segregation laws, and everything about growing up here was about race. And it was something that from the very beginning of my life, or at least my young adult years and on to today, is an attempt to understand why is this such a still, after all of these years, such a stain on the American consciousness. Why is it still so divisive, and why are we, still so preoccupied with the term race?
And what would your answer be to that? Why do you think it is?
I think it's a multi-generational process for white people to have a sense of kind of, this is our country, and everybody else is coming into our country or being in our country, like African American, Native American, but it's our country, and so I think we have a psychological response to any changes in our lives, any lessening of our position in society. Although this is not recognized very often, that's why I titled the book "Deep Denial." It's we for generations, people called white in this country have assumed a preeminent state in terms of this nation's racial construct. And when that seems threatened, or when that seems to be changing, I think we get the reaction that you've seen in this country, over the past couple of months. But it has always been there, and it's not, it's not just white people in the South. It's the whole nation. Has this assumption, sort of like a racial pecking order, and where white has always been on top. That's why the term white privilege is often used. But it's a structural phenomenon. It's not just individuals. In fact, I think individual race prejudice is because of the institutions and systems of society that we, as white people, have taken in and lived out.
Okay, so let me just ask you this. Whites are threatened, it seems. Let me just say, weren't the Native Americans here before whites?
Oh yes, yeah, for many centuries, even millennia, probably. But absolutely. But the native peoples, the strategy was different in terms of native peoples. It was removal by any means necessary. The idea that as the country grew independently of any other relationship like it had had with Great Britain, the Indians were pushed out, and along the way they, of course, survived it. African peoples were brought here for one purpose, and that was to be enslaved and to help build the economy. And that's tragic in both of those examples. But that is the founding ethos, if you will, of this nation, in my opinion. And to understand that is crucial if you're going to work in a multicultural, multi-ethnic nation as we have now.
So, I mean, shouldn't black folks, and I'm black, by the way, shouldn't we be highly respected? I mean, this country was built off our backs. Yeah.
Absolutely. But therein lies the denial. That's not admitted by many white people. We, of course, have some, and maybe an increasing number of white people who understand that this nation was built on free labor and free land for those of us called white. And so, but in the main, whites are in denial about this. We've been taught for many centuries now that we have what we have because we've worked hard and made sacrifices, and we're willing to do the hard work of a citizenry. But in fact, everybody works hard in this country and always have. But we have mythologies that are grained into our psyche, I think, as white people, about how we differ in terms of our relationship with this country when compared to people of color. Well, especially black people.
Yeah, well, you said everybody works hard, but I mean, I understand it's the black folks who are building, they use them to build the roadways, the bridges, and so forth. To me, that's hard labor right there.
It certainly is. And, and again, the purpose of the book is to point out to white people that reality supersedes, if you will, the mythology that has somehow white people being the ones who worked hard and built this country. But, it's just as you say, in large measure, this country was built not only by people of color, but white people of the working classes. But again, it's just not something that is emphasized in much of our upbringing or schooling for whites, that this is, in fact, the way it is. And that's why you see the resentment, in my opinion, that surfaced during the recent election, because, this is something that has been ingrained in us, this sense of I am an American. I'm not hyphenated. I don't have to put a color code in front of my name. I can just be me in this society, and in so doing, I have to buy into a lot of this arrangement that I now take for granted, and don't attribute it to my racial designation.
Yeah, well, I can see that people are running scared because most recently, I mean, where I live, there are KKK posters showing up, and people are like really lashing out. It's interesting that you, as a white person, is bringing this to the forefront. I mean, Black history needs to be taught, but there's a lot of things that's hidden unless you really go digging deeply. And as I mentioned to someone before, the movie Hidden Figures Had I not watched it, I wouldn't have known that black
That's right.
women, actually female scientists, were responsible for John Glenn and the crew going out into space. You
Isn't
know,
that amazing that that's just now coming out? That's an incredible story that happened 50, almost 60 years ago. Is just now coming into the public consciousness, and it's amazing on a number of fronts. It's amazing what those women accomplished and the role they played in this nation's history. It's also amazing that it was kept secret for all of these years, and that just shows you how race works in this country. You get over-credited if you're white, you get under-credited, if that's a word, if you're of color, particularly if you're black. This nation is hot-wired by race. Everything really is impacted by race. People of color know that. They have to live through it. Those of us who are white, it's the denial of that keeps things in such a tension-filled posture, where race is always kind of right at the boiling point, if you will, and threatens to come out. I think white people in the country, they fear, this is my opinion, they fear a multicultural nation. It's not economics. If economics were the reason, you would find poor and working class whites joining up with people of color to bring about changes. But you never hear that. You hear white people are angry and alienated and all this stuff, but you don't hear any of us saying, "Well, I'm going to join up with other people who have their own issues with how this society works." At least I haven't heard it. And I think the reason for that is that we fear a multicultural nation. This is not what we bargained for, and thus we are afraid of what's going to happen in the future to our grandchildren, say, because we think that the social contract that was made in the nation's founding years was with white people. That's why you would hear us say, I want my country back. Well, what a statement. And what could you be talking about? Well, you're talking about a time where white people's role and position in society was a given. It was just part of the makeup of this society. And we now, in my opinion, again, feel that that's under siege. It's under threat, and thus we act in ways that are hateful. We act in ways that are mean, and we have a tendency to kind of wall ourselves off, an interesting term, from the rest of the world. So, it's that white superiority. White people don't study white superiority. We are not challenged in our schooling. That's something in the past, we think. But it's very much in the present and in the future if we don't undo it.
Yeah, it's a sense of whites feel entitled, and that's the
right.
attitude. Whites don't have to prove anything. You have to constantly prove who you are, and I'm a living testimony. I'm going on 80 years old, but still, I have to say, I'm just kidding, by the way, a few years back, I had a job.
You got a mighty young voice.
Well, you know what it is? They have surgery for everything, Mr. Billings.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was working at a job, and I was very close with my boss. Little did I know, she was like the serpent, because one day she was. I'm fair-skinned. Not that fair that you can't identify who I am. That being said, she was trying to tiptoe around it to say who I was. So I said, "Let me help you. I am black." And she says, Don't put yourself down by comparing yourself to those people. What?
Yeah, really.
Those are some of the attitudes. So if you're just joining us, you're inside Cool Meditations. It's 16 minutes on the right side of 7 o'clock. On the phone line, we have author David Billings. He's the author of Deep Denial. He's going to be in Poughkeepsie March 8th, 6 to 8 p.m. at the Family Partnership Center. And Mr. Billings is from the South, I believe he said Mississippi. And so give us a glimpse of what life was back then in Mississippi, some of the things that you observed.
Yeah, it was very violent, for one. And, black people were under, let's say, constitutional restraints. They had really all the way back to the Dred Scott decision where the Supreme Court said, black people have no rights, that white people need respect. That was still the case when I was growing up. Black people could not serve on juries. They couldn't make judicial decisions against white people. It was a strict apartheid type arrangement that kept us apart and blaming each other for our conditions, when in fact, if we worked together, then maybe we would change this thing. And this challenge still presents itself to us. It's very difficult for white people to ally themselves with others because we have not been accustomed to doing that. We've always been assumed a certain position in this society, and so there's no need for us to work in coalition or to work together. But in fact, there always has been that need and still is today.
So you were raised in that environment. You saw all this, and what makes you want to come out and advocate for black folks?
Well, I'm really advocating that whites learn more about themselves and how this phenomenon that the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, which I'm a part of, stresses, is that whites need to understand not a mythology around race, but the reality of race that keeps us from being trusted, that keeps us from understanding why people of color relate to us the way they do. It's, for most of us, and I include myself in everything that I'm saying, we have very superficial relationships, particularly with black people. We think we know black people, but in fact, we could hardly know less than we actually do. It's amazing. But again, that's why superiority, racial superiority, which is a term not used because it's associated with hate groups, but that's not how I use it. I think that white superiority, if you will, racial superiority, is something that all of us as white people have to one degree or another. But again, we are not required to face ourselves. I point out in our workshops that, there's no degree in academic degree, field of study that requires its graduates, whether it's the legal field, criminal justice, education, healthcare, none of those require an understanding of the nation's racial arrangement. Yet, it is that which we will face in the profession. That's why a lot of white teachers, for example, or social workers, we're kind of at a loss when we find ourselves working with constituents of color because that hasn't been factored into our educational experience. It sounds crazy, but in fact it's the truth. Dealing with racism is always an elective for white people. We can choose to deal with it and understand it and eye roll in it, or we can choose not to. That's very different than what you see from people of color who have no choice but to understand race and to learn how to survive it. The arrangement is kept in place by those of us who are white being ignorant and uninformed about this. And I, in the book, I use myself as an example of one of those who grew up in an environment like I described, but also in an environment that allowed me great mobility, great opportunities to educate myself and to, build a modicum of wealth for my family. This is very different. Other people have to overcome, as they do, this racial arrangement. We have to understand that as white people. Racism is not invented by people of color. It was created by white people. And yet, one of the ways we keep it in place is not studying our own role. We think that racism has to do with bigotry. And, that's a piece of it, but it's by no means the main impact or the main understanding of race in this country. It's not you can love everybody, and if you're white, you can still benefit from that in this racially hierarchical arrangement in this country.
Yeah. I want to switch to something different. Now, you are a minister, as we mentioned before.
Yes.
Some people have said that white folks use religion or Christianity to keep black folks in submission. What do you have to say to that?
Well, that has been the case. I would think that now, the use of Christianity is warped by white people as something that upholds a certain status quo, so that without even saying it, we reinforce this arrangement. The church was definitely used and still is in some ways to maintain white superiority. And we don't, I think that Jesus was kidnapped by white people, and I'm speaking not so much metaphorically, but he was taken from what would have been the truth of his message and made into something that was used as a defense of white supremacy. It's heretical. It is an incredible misuse of what we call the gospel in Christianity.
Can you explain how it's misused?
It's misused by using Jesus as an example of how white people are in charge. It's used to give God's blessings, if you will, to this racial status quo. And it's ironic that, the same understanding of Jesus, it supports both white supremacy and it supports liberation. And that contradiction, that ambiguity, is something that compromises the church. The church has another part of its history which is very liberating and siding with the poor. But for the most part, our churches are silent on racism. We'll follow, we will address ourselves to many different conditions in this society, or isms, as we say. But usually racism gets short shrift. We either say, well, that was back then, it's not like that now. But it is like this now. That's why, this rash of shootings of young black men by the police, that has always happened. That's nothing new. What's new is that, because of advances in technology and everything, we can document these kind of brutish behaviors. But I don't the police are just representative of a much larger arrangement in this country. They're not the cause of it. They're the enforcers, but yet, they're working for somebody else, if you will.
Okay, so we just have a few minutes left, but before you go, I want to touch on the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. What is that? Tell us about it.
Yeah, it's an organization led by people of color that was created in 1980. That's when we started. And our emphasis, as opposed to other types of training, has always been on community organizing. People's Institute feels you can't educate racism away, you can't pray it away, you can't legislate it away. You've got to organize across the various racial divides to confront this reality. And when you achieve a critical mass, then you can see these systems in this country, they change when the people organize. It's really the only way they change in any substantial way. So People's Institute does undoing racism workshops across the United States, different parts of the world, and that's our emphasis. We've done a lot of work in Westchester County, and that is why the leaders who are doing anti-racist work in Hudson Valley, for example. In some ways, we've been everywhere in that regard, and people have been tremendously responsible. You get some great organizers in the Hudson Valley that are bringing about real change.
All right, and so are you by writing this book. And speaking of the book, we're going to wrap things up now. What can people expect?
Well, I've tried very hard, and some think successfully, to use my own life as an example of someone who was influenced from the time I was born by messages that come from the larger society that create a sense of racial superiority in me, and that's not criticizing myself unduly. It's in fact the truth. Even as I do the work to undo racism, I'm also a beneficiary, myself, my family, of this racial arrangement. To the degree that I don't understand that, it makes it very hard for me to work with people that have been categorized in other ways. So this book, I use stories from my own life, and then I do a history of what was going on in the nation at the time that I'm writing. So in my first 10 years, and then my college years, and then my professional years. There are all these messages out there that reinforce the racial arrangement. That's what the book's about. It's about what is white people's role in it, and how can we, there are many genuine white people who want to see change, but we don't know what's involved in that change, and so we can appear to people of color rather disingenuous. How can you not see it? Well, we don't see it because for generations we've been kept in the dark about it.
Well, you can't change what you don't acknowledge, right?
Exactly.
So it needs to be acknowledged. Well, you know what? We're going to acknowledge that author and minister David Billings will be at the Family Partnership March 8th, 6 to 8 p.m., and they're at 29 North Hamilton Street. So if you'd like to hear more, he'll be there with the book. Alrighty. So it's been a pleasure and a blessing speaking with you. And if my schedule permits, I may be there to meet with you.
No, that'd be great. Thank you for inviting me on your show, Miss Williams.
Alrighty. No problem. Take care and God bless you.
Bye-bye.